Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is a Washington, D.C. update on federal government policy developments. It is put on by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. Speakers on today's webinar are the on-the-ground government relations and strategic communications teams for NTMA and PMA. I'm Caitlin Sickles. I'm a senior principal in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. Also on the webinar, we have from Bracewell, Paul Nathanson, and we have the team from the Franklin Partnership. So that's Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. As I said, we are the on-the-ground team here in Washington, D.C., representing small and medium-sized manufacturers who make up NTMA and PMA. John and Omar doing the lobbying up on Capitol Hill, Paul and I doing public relations and public affairs for both associations. On today's webinar, we will be covering a wide range of federal policy issues, what's going on in Congress, give you an update on regulatory issues, and we'll talk, as we always do, about trade issues as well as tariff issues and supply chain issues. If you have questions during the webinar, we do encourage you to ask questions. Please use the chat function on the side of your GoToWebinar screen. We will be monitoring that space and we'll try to take as many questions as possible. Of course, if we can't get to your question, we will follow up with you after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. You can find a copy of it on the PMA and NTMA websites. You can also find them on onevoiceinfo.org. That's where you can find this webinar as well as copies of all of the previous webinars that we have done going back to 2020. We will at the end talk to you also about our podcast, Talking with One Voice, where you can hear more content like this. So with that, let me turn it over to John Guzik. John, talk to us about what's going on in Congress.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, everybody. Well, before Congress broke for the July 4th recess, the House Ways and Means, and we've mentioned this before in previous webinars that we've held, that we told you that the House was working on a tax bill. There's a number of expiring tax provisions that needed to be addressed that would impact NTMA and PMA members. And before the Congress broke for the July 4th recess, the House Ways and Means Committee, Republicans passed with only Republican vote, passed a tax bill, which, I mean, it was a home run for us. We got all of the issues that we've been working on. It included our research and development section 174 fix. It restored it to January 1 of 2022 retroactively. We restored bonus depreciation back to 100%. As many of you know, it dropped to 80% January 1 this year. It fixed the business loan interest deduction, EBITDA. It restored that, and it expanded small business expensing. It doubled Section 179 expensing to $2.5 million. So where do we go from here? Over July 4th, the staff have been working on putting the language together, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and we fully expect the House of Representatives to pass the bill largely on a party line vote, probably exclusively on a party line vote, with just Republicans voting to pass it sometime in July. But what this is the opening salvo in negotiations with the Senate. Now that the House has demonstrated an ability to pass a bill, we fully expect it'll be part of a year-end tax package. Eventually, the Senate will take up their version of a tax package, and that they will work on merging the differences between the House and Senate versions.
So that means you're likely still looking at somewhere, we'd suggest second or third week in December before you might see a final solution, including, as John referenced, that 174 fix, which means it would allow you to fully expense your R&D activities and remove the requirements for amortization and capitalization. But John, I want you to keep going with the government spending bills, because many might think that for the tax bill language, the tax extenders, their likely vehicle might end up being a year-end government spending bill that they're starting on right now.
Yeah, now that the House and Senate have come to an agreement with the president on raising the debt ceiling, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees are starting their due diligence on passing the government funding bills, and we fully expect there are 12 appropriations bills that need to pass. The House and Senate have done very little work on passing individual appropriations bills. Keep in mind, government spending expires on September 30th. And as part of the debt ceiling, some people think, well, they're not going to have a government shutdown. Well, the debt ceiling agreement does not exclude a government shutdown. If the House and Senate can't agree on a continuing resolution to keep the government funding through perhaps December 31st, there is a possibility of a shutdown. The biggest issue is you're looking at House appropriators are considering bills at FY22 levels. The Senate Democrats are considering bills as part of the debt ceiling agreement, which was FY23. So many would say that passing legislation at FY22 levels will result in draconian cuts, and that is going to be the holdup between the negotiations between the House and Senate. If you recall from as part of the debt ceiling agreement, if they can't pass all 12 appropriations bills by December 31st, there's across the board 1% cut. And the House and Senate are so far apart on this, we'll just have to stay tuned.
All right, so the process then, you'll look to see by the end of July, likely most of the bills, if not all, will likely pass the US House. The Senate is not going to be on that pathway. They are going to try to complete many of them on their own, set up negotiations later in the calendar year. Coming up also, the remainder to round out the summer, the US House is going to be in session for 12 total legislative business days, including some half days, quarter days, starting this coming week when they return next week. And a few of the draft bills that we know that they're already discussing, because we've seen them, we're working with some staff on them. They are working to update the National Apprenticeship Act for the first time since 1937. Congress literally has not touched that level in 80 plus years, and that's going to be a priority of ours. We've got that draft language from committee staff for our review. Anybody that is currently serving on a workforce investment board, please reach out to Jenny at NTMA or Christy at PMA for us, so we can maybe get in touch and try to get some more information on your workforce investment board, workforce development board programs, what works, what isn't working. PFAS, we know increasingly you're hearing questions from your customers about this and whether it exists in any of your operations. There is a more industry favorable definition of 2 carbon atoms that was just released, and so we're looking at seeing some movement there. And a trade bill is starting to come together. We do occasionally get a question on this, and the generalized system of preferences, GSP, for countries, allowing them to have a lower temporary tariff rate for developing nations. That is on the table for a year-end possible trade bill, and that would be retroactive for those of you that are involved in GSP, know how significant that is to you. The next few slides we thought we would do, and I'll turn it over to John to kick us off here in a second, is this is going to be a little bit separate. We'll come to what is currently happening on regulations, but twice a year, and since 1983, I think it is, the US government, the federal agencies have been required to release what the agenda is in the short term and then in the long term agenda for their regulatory activities. This means that every federal agency out there puts out a list of all the different rules and potential rules that they put out, notice of proposed rulemakings, and the timeline for that to happen. So the coming slides are what you see. They do this twice a year. The spring agenda was just released about a month ago now on June 12th. And the usefulness here for businesses is to be able to look forward at what regulations might be coming their way to help you plan and help you understand what exposure you or your customers might have. So since 1978, they've been publishing these and then doing them now twice a year since the early 80s. John, take it away if you want to get us started on medium heavy duty vehicles. We're not going to run through all of them, but just to give you a sense of what's coming, and you can see the link here if you want more information on each individual one.
Yeah, the Department of Transportation, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration are preparing a rule on the GSG emissions for medium heavy duty trucks. We expected something in June, so we expect some sort of proposed rule coming out imminently. Similarly, for light duty vehicles, we're expecting the DOT and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to release their CAFE standards imminently at any time.
Yeah, another one that's out there, EPA cost benefit analysis or benefit cost analysis calculation. This is where you put an actual dollar amount on the cost of carbon that's being emitted under the social cost of carbon calculations and the other considerations that factor in when an agency is deciding whether or not to move forward with the rule. And so you do this cost benefit analysis, and where this administration, just like Obama, takes in secondary emissions, other areas that are causing, and that's how they used to justify regulations. We're expecting to see that one in September. On the trade side, before we get into the big ones over at Labor and OSHA, the Commerce Department is looking at making changes to how it investigates and does enforcement activities on anti-dumping and countervailing duties. They are putting in to limit the amount of time that's taken, some of the terms that are going to be changed, also particular market situation where it allows them to focus on a subset of categories within a trade action. This is something that the trade community, at least those that are petitioners, have been looking for from the trade lawyer side for some time, and that would allow them to be able to move more efficiently through the AD/CVD process. We're expecting a final action there coming up here in September on that final rule. One of them that we've been watching very, very closely is the overtime rule coming out from Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor. This is a back and forth that's been going on. The Obama administration, before they left office, tried to more than double at the time the threshold for who's eligible for time and a half from 23,000 to 47,000. The court struck that down. The Trump administration came in and set it at the current rate of 35,568, meaning anybody that's salaried employees that's not subject to an exemption, excuse me, an exclusion, then would be eligible for time and a half. Anybody under the 35,568 currently is. The Biden administration, we're hearing, might try to take that up to at least 50,000, maybe 55, 58,000. And that's a rule that has now been pushed back and expected next month. And it could potentially take effect as early as January 1 of the coming year. So it's something to watch closely. John, another one in August too, independent contractor rule.
Yeah, this is another regulation that has been treated like a ping pong ball. Before the Trump administration left office in January 2021, Department of Labor published independent contractor rule. Then in March of 21, the Biden administration says, hey, we're going to delay and withdraw this regulation. Well, a Texas court in March of 22 said, no, you can't do that. And so now you've got Department of Labor who is considering rescinding and coming up with new guidelines for independent contractor rule. And we expect, so they're going to rescind the 2021 rule, and we expect it in August. Similarly, under the National Labor Relations Board joint employer, we expect in August as well. This is where the Department of Labor says can determine if two employers can be treated as one as a joint employer. So this is particularly important for those of you who have temporary staffing associations that you work with, temporary staff and such. And so we'll be watching that very closely.
Yeah, a few others to round out. I know Paul.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
The other one,
Paul, you got this recently.
This is outrageous. Is the union where the OSHA can ask a union representative while doing an inspection of your facility, can ask a union representative to join the OSHA inspector as they walk through your facility. Again, this is something that's coming up imminently, expected to come out in June.
Yeah, so point of clarification, OSHA can't ask a union rep to come. What would happen is an employee can ask a union rep to join them, even if the company is not organized. That single employee can ask that union or that union representative to accompany that OSHA inspector. The OSHA inspector has the right to decline or accept it, so it would not be forced upon them. That's something to notice there, that difference that's coming up as well. Mechanical power press rule is still a little ways off, as kind of is tied in with a few other areas. We provided comments on this. They're continuing to analyze those comments, but many of these, the rules go back 40 plus years. They literally go back to the 70s and don't have CNCs. They don't have any of the kind of new machinery that you all have been using over the last 3 decades. So that's something. But one notice area that we've been working on going back to the Obama administration here is lockout tagout. That rule is now delayed till 2024. They had originally, when they put out their fall unified agenda, had it planned for coming out this month in July of 23. It's now been delayed, and NPRM means a notice of proposed rulemaking, and that comes before what is called a final rule. So on lockout tagout and the control of hazardous energy, when a machine, think of a press, for example, going up and down, or a machine, CNC machine moving quickly, that's where they want to be able to stop. In this case, they've been talking about completely locking the machine out, completely de-energizing it as well for routine changes. That's been a concern for you when you do a tool change, for example, under the Kershaw exemption, and that's something that we've been concerned about, but now we've got another year. But speaking of final rules, John, we do know the White House has been reviewing since April the 300, 301, 300-day e-file rule.
Yeah, this is under the injury illness. They've been reviewing it. We expect it to come out at any time. Those with over 100 employees will have to file your 300, 301, 300A electronically annually. Those with over 20 employees would have to file your 300A annually. The other issue is that we've been bringing up on webinars and on our weekly calls is what OSHA is considering is their heat rule. This is when the heat index exceeds 80 degrees. They're proposing a rule that will require employers to mitigate to address heat in the workplace. Originally, it was intended to be just for construction and landscaping, but OSHA has decided to make it an indoor and outdoor heat rule. And this is from their website, which just explains their justification for considering a heat rule. And we're going to talk about this a little more as we talk more about regulations. Omar, the SPRIA.
Yeah, SBREFA. And so what OSHA is, what you saw on the previous slide was, again, the Unified Regulatory Agenda Notice announcing their timeline of that to move forward on August with what we call a SBREFA. This is a link where you can go to the Department of Labor officially requesting it. They don't have a proposed rule. What they are in the stage of is considering whether or not to release the proposed rule. They are continuing to be in the stakeholder input. We've been a part of a number of their stakeholder meetings over the since July of last year, or late July was the first time we met with OSHA director himself and his deputy on the heat rule. Again, what would require a number of things. It could potentially, if it's modeled after California, where indoor would require cool down stations. So you might have to fabricate an area for employees after it exceeds 80 degrees Fahrenheit to have a special area for you to cool down. They would also have to prescribe rest breaks. Some have been talking about every 2.5 hours, every 2 hours, 15 minutes. Again, would depend on how much you're exceeding the heat index in that indoor work setting. Would have to do continuous monitoring potentially, and means in the environmental monitoring in that workplace, not just in one part of the shop, but in different areas, potentially located near machinery, where obviously it'll be hot. They don't have variations based on geographical location or on industry at this point. We expect on August 21st to have at least a concept of what they might be looking at doing over at OSHA on an indoor-outdoor heat rule. This is the announcement that they've convened what's called the SBREFA, a Small Business Regulatory Enforcement and Fairness Act. And what a SBREFA is it's comprised of different government entities and nonprofit groups, and small businesses are going to participate. We will be filing comments as soon as we receive it. What is considered a small business is defined by the Small Business Administration under your NAICS codes. The vast majority of you are going to be under 500 employees or fewer. If you're under 500 employees, you are considered a small business under total controlled. So if you've got shops in 3 different states, you're going to combine those together to get your head count for a small business definition. If you're an automotive stamper, you have 1,000 or fewer, or excuse me, under 1,000 employees. That's your limit for being considered a small business. So you'd have to check your NAICS codes, which you can see right here. What happens in a SBREFA is it can be 50, it can be 100 of them that participate. What we're hearing is it probably will be a significant number of companies and nonprofits and other entities that participate and provide input on how a potential rule will impact them. August 21st, this will convene, which starts a 60-day clock. We're hearing OSHA wants to keep a very strict timeline, and they potentially want to have this wrapped up by the end of October, which would allow them to move forward because they cannot issue a new rule on the SBREFA or on the heat rule, or proposed rule rather, until they get through the SBREFA panel. And the SBREFA panel is going to cover everything from hazard identification, prevention and control measures, as John mentioned, what worker training, record keeping, the scope of the potential standards that should be there. Again, it's going to be difficult if they do try to regulate dry cleaners, agriculture workers, and manufacturers all in the same. And even within manufacturing, there's different kinds of shops out there as well. So the timeline on this, we could see a proposed rule sometime in the winter, maybe even right after the new year. And as we've been warning you and telling you, OSHA put together 2 working groups. One of the working groups was about communications and how to inform the public with regards to the OSHA heat emphasis campaign. We talked in last month about that emphasis campaign, and now we've told you, here's how they've shown you in different languages where you can heat illness prevention at work brochure. What we're picking up is that OSHA will likely require through certain regions and certain areas that you inform and educate your employees in certain languages. So for example, if you've got a strong Polish constituency in that area around Chicago, in Cook County, likely the OSHA is going to require that there as well. So a few other things to run through, John. There's a new poster that's got to be put up retroactive to January 27. Hopefully folks have got that up already.
Yeah, this is Know Your Rights poster. The next couple slides, you can probably just share it with your HR person. They can click on the link if they don't have that poster already, but the poster needs to be up. This is the Know Your Rights poster. And then the EEOC is doing an equal pay campaign. And so they're inviting people to add this to your social media, level the paying field. So to talk about positive stories about equal pay in the workplace. But Omar, I know the EPA has been working on a waters of the U.S. rule for months, years now, and the Supreme Court had a recent decision, which is having the EPA reconsider what they were looking at for the waters of the U.S.
Right. So under WOTUS, as we refer to it, Waters of the United States, the EPA sought to regulate waterways that were underground, that were not contiguous, but they said that could still be connected as it drifted. So if you had a man-made cooling station out in the back, for example, the federal EPA would want to seek regulation under that, under U.S. waterways rules, saying it connected potentially into the other groundwater sources that were leading into a nearby stream. And that would have added years of additional permitting and additional requirements that are out there that were non-navigable coast waterways, and that was a big deal in terms of trying to restrict and rein in the EPA's authority and whether or not they in fact had that authority to do so. The Supreme Court said effectively no, that you could not go Biden administration continuing what Obama did, sent it back. And so now you're going to see another round. We're not done with this yet, but it is important to a lot of our manufacturers, particularly in more rural areas. This would certainly impact you if you do have a waterway somewhat nearby your facility. You could have further regulations placed upon you if you try to do some expansions. But sticking with the EPA, Paul, we're going to throw it over to you for a minute here as well.
Yeah, thanks. Just one litigation update involving the EPA that I thought would interest people is that the Department of Justice last week withdrew a civil rights investigation that the EPA requested it undertake. The civil rights investigation, EPA claimed that the LDEQ, which is Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, and their health department discriminated against minorities for failing to regulate chemical emissions from a bunch of plants down there in what is called Cancer Alley. So they asked the DOJ to launch an investigation. It was really an assault on the state of Louisiana and the agencies. The Louisiana Attorney General, who also happens to be running for governor, challenged the investigation in a filing last month, and to the surprise of some, that the DOJ basically closed the investigation after only a few months because they said there are other ways that EPA can deal with this issue, including they're going to do a cumulative impact analysis of emissions. So the implications, the relevancy for you manufacturers who are on the call today is that the EPA is trying all these different environmental justice initiatives and trying to do these legal filings to see what works. And it's an example of the aggressiveness of EPA in their environmental justice push. And number two, it also marks a significant, we believe, a significant defeat for them, or the DOJ. I think DOJ attorneys looked at this and said to the EPA, this is not the right path that you're going for. We really don't have a leg to stand on. So there's several other interesting pieces of litigation involving Louisiana and some chemical plants down there. We're involved with one involving chloroprene. And if folks are interested in what the EPA is doing down this road, feel free to contact me. Thanks, Omar.
I think that's also lawyers speak for they couldn't win the case on the Fifth Circuit, so decided to pull it so they didn't have a losing verdict from the judge.
Yeah, although the AG did not, AG challenged the investigation in court and today filed a briefing that they will not withdraw their case because they say EPA is doing a lot of other things to Louisiana, so that case is going to continue.
Yeah. So if you hadn't had enough from regulations from us by now, this is the last slide, we promise. We do at our firm go through every single agency to comb through those, looking for regulatory actions that would impact you all. This one took 7 hours to go through. And what we do is we have it in a single Excel tracking matrix running through by agency. So this is a snapshot of what you would see if anybody really wants to, for whatever reason, go through and take a look at this. It is quite an exhaustive list, and you can go through the different, it includes everything from, by the way, we're expecting a new NIST rule for those of you that deal with cybersecurity under NIST 800 circular, so that potentially could be updated, as well as a number of other requirements that are coming out. So we do actually encourage you, have somebody just browse through that, and it is a useful thing to take a look at. We do know we had our jobs numbers out this morning. They weren't as great, but if you take a look at your long-term trends for manufacturing construction spending, this is a serious chart that really shows quite a bit of spikes here going on. And obviously, this is the build rate for bricks and mortar, which means they're going to be around in terms of productivity for the foreseeable future, not really just a blip or a trend. So it's something to take a look at in terms of just market economy. One more here, and I'll turn it over to John. You can talk about the NOFO here. But foreign direct investment in Mexico is continued to increase. This is a trend we've seen every few months. We'll throw up a slide in this slide deck for you all to take a look at in terms of the industrial park growth that's going on. We are currently obviously seeing quite a bit. There's another chart that breaks this down even further, and you can see the level of Chinese FDI going into Mexico, foreign direct investment. That's what's going in there. And then obviously, as a direct result of that FDI, you can see on this chart that exports from Mexico are increasing, in many ways attributed to more shipments coming into the United States for your planning purposes. John, you want to jump in here on chips, or you can jump in on Treasury, up to you on the next one.
So Washington is built on acronyms, NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunities. So as a result of the passage of the CHIPS bill, they've come out with opportunities, funding opportunities, and this is for large semiconductor supply chain projects to construct, expand, or modernize your facility for chip materials and equipment. So it's just not just chips, it's materials and equipment. For those who would be eligible, there's you can get direct cash, loans, or loan guarantees.
Yeah, you'd have to be a significant, it's majority of the project needs to be dedicated to semiconductors, the materials. So it can't be that I do semiconductor work as 10% of my shop and I plan on doing expansion. It really has to be the vast majority, if not pretty much all of what you're doing that's out there. So note though, there will be another notice of funding opportunities coming out later. We're hoping maybe in October time range for those projects that are less than $300 million that are out there. Sticking with dollars, Treasury report, as always, has come out and says that no trading partner has met all the criteria required to have a determination of them being a currency manipulator, despite what we know that China has done over the years. This again is not, this has been going on for years. It goes all the way back to Clinton. They haven't really been calling China, for example, a currency manipulator, even though that you can see, for example, the Chinese yuan, the RMB here, valuation against the dollar continuing to change and dropping to some lows right there as well. A couple last things here on trade, John. We've got USTR, and this ties into steel as well on the greenhouse gas investigation that they're moving forward on.
Yeah, USTR has asked the International Trade Commission to do a study on the impact of the greenhouse gas emissions on steel and aluminum production. This is part of a global agreement on sustainable steel and aluminum production. And so, they're going to study not only what is the greenhouse gas emissions in the production of steel and aluminum, but also study what impact non-market economies will, what impact, how non-market economies produce steel and aluminum, and what impact it has on excess capacity around the world. And then the USTR has asked the ITC to complete this report by January of 2025.
Yeah,
So this is interesting. Yeah, before you jump in, Paul, it's interesting, and I do want to get your thoughts on this even before India, because we got 2 more slides, so we've got about another 3-4 minutes to run here. They're asking for a note that it's not going to be due here for another 18 months. That is a typical timeline for a report like this. But in the meantime, by October 31st, somehow the US and European Union were supposed to come to an agreement on something similar, which would apply a carbon tariff to carbon intense products of steel and aluminum from around the country entering into the 27 nation bloc or the United States. They are not close to a deal on that based on everything we're seeing on that. Financial Times had a pretty good readout on it the other day as well. I know Bracewell has been watching it closely. So just goes hand in hand with what the government's trying to do in other spaces, but the timelines don't fully align. I don't know, Paul, what your thoughts are on this, but USTR is certainly trying to incorporate GHG somehow.
Yeah, and the U.S. was not enthusiastic about measuring its own domestic source steel industry on this, and would rather just create the club and with China on the outside. Also, there is the U.S. ITC announced that there'll be a public hearing if you want to mark your calendars for the date that will live in infamy. December 7th will be the public hearing on this report on the greenhouse gas emissions. Also wanted to mention that the U.S. and India, during Indian Prime Minister Modi's visit earlier in June to Washington, D.C., announced that they have reached an agreement on a dispute that was triggered by the U.S. Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum exports. Unlike previous deals that they made with that the U.S. has made with the EU and the U.K. and Japan, the deal is, as announced, is that the Indians have withdrawn their WTO filings regarding disputing the legality of the tariffs, and they have lifted retaliatory tariffs on certain U.S. exports, agricultural products that the U.S. agriculture industry was not happy with. And in return, the U.S. only promised that they would continue the pace of exclusions for Indian steel and aluminum products that basically they have been doing over the past couple of years. So the U.S. really didn't make many concessions, only pledging that the commerce exclusion process would continue to exclude Indian metals products on a pace, and also that Indians claim that this could increase Indian steel and aluminum exports to the U.S. by 35%, but it seems like it was a pretty good deal for the U.S. on the U.S. side. They got the Indians to drop the tariffs without really doing anything differently on the Section 232 steel tariffs.
I think that's a good summation.
Yeah.
Mentioned at the outset of the webinar that we have a podcast. So if you like content like you hear on the webinar, but you want a little bit more in depth and also a little bit more politics, because we do talk a little more politics on the podcast, you can find us on any podcast platform. It's called Talking with One Voice. You can find us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. If you're already subscribing, that's great, and thank you. If you have time and can rate or review the show, that's great too. But do check it out.
Rate and review if you like it. If you like the podcast.
Yeah, no bad reviews, please. Good point.
If you don't like it, just don't listen to it anymore.
But please do donate.
Move
Please
along,
do support
haters,
any
is
way
what
that
we're
you
saying.
can. Yeah, exactly. Please do donate. You can support us any way you can. It's always helpful. Please also type in any questions on the right-hand side. We've got 2 already that we'll go ahead and address right now. And as always, please reach out to us here in DC or to Jenny over at NTMA and Christy at PMA with any questions that you might have or some more details that you might need. 2 quick questions that we received. One is on GSP, Generalized System of Preferences. Would China be considered a developing nation? And the answer is no. China is not on the list. I believe there's 119 GSP eligible beneficiary developing countries. So no, they are not on there. One of the areas of concern and will be up for debate is India. India is still currently on the list of GSP beneficiaries. And so there is possibly going to be some discussion about removing them for a number of obvious reasons. And then the other question we received is, what is the current status of legislation on resetting the R&D tax credit? Just clarify, Section 41, the R&D tax credit is still in effect. This is Section 174. This is what you're actually referring to, that Congress put in place in 2017. The timeline for a fix on that is likely, we believe, late December. They're likely going to tie that in with some other legislation. And so they would eliminate the requirement to capitalize and amortize your R&D activities. They would eliminate that retroactive to January 1 of 2022 is what the House language currently has. And the idea then would be allow you to fully expense your R&D activities again, retroactive January 1 of 2022, if the language goes through as written by the House. We're a long ways away from there, but the current timeline is probably November, December on that one. Any other questions? We're just at 12:34, so we're hoping to wrap up. Please feel free to reach out to us if nothing else. Great. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Look forward to talking next month. Our next webinar will be on Friday, August 4th at noon Eastern. Thank you all.